very much, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. And I want to start by talking about the federal government, right? I think that many New Yorkers, I can see it in the street, like when I report on political stories, that there are not that many New Yorkers who are happy with this administration in Washington, D.C. They might not be huge fans of the president. And at the same time, we have a local government that in many different instances doesn't want to cooperate with the federal government and with the Trump administration, the state government. So why is it that right now, when it comes to the census, that is a federal initiative, why are you telling New Yorkers to participate?
Okay, I'm happy to start off with that. So I'm wearing my hat from the City Law Department. We did indeed sue the Trump administration on the citizenship question. We were one of the lead plaintiffs in that case. We won that case at the Supreme Court. Fair and square. Now, with that said, we have so much at stake with the census. So while the Trump administration has undoubtedly attempted to thwart New York City by basically causing fear and intimidation, we need to then double down on our efforts to educate New Yorkers about what's at stake with the census. The census is totally confidential. It's protected by Title 13 of the U.S. Code. The information cannot be shared. The citizenship question is not on the census. We're fighting for our share of over $650 billion that the federal government allocates every year. So everything is at stake, from public education to public housing. So if people just say, I'm not going to fill that out because I'm upset with the Trump administration, that honestly is a win for President Trump. So that's not what we're trying to do, and that's not the message that New York City wants to convey. On the contrary, the census is for everyone, and we want to make sure that every single New Yorker stands up and gets counted. And the last thing I'll mention, I see Jolie back there from the Federal Census Bureau. We have a fantastic relationship with the Regional Federal Census Bureau here. They are doing their job in trying to make sure that New York City does a proper count. Many of them are civil servants. The regional head, Jeff Baylor, worked in the Obama administration. So I really want to emphasize that because that's important that people understand that.
I think just to follow up on that, and I'm sure is one of the important points of the exhibit, is that the census transcends this administration. It's not about the Trump administration. You know, the census is it's the first article of the Constitution. When we talk about how we represent we the people, we have to know who the people are and where they are. So, it has been conflated and politicized when we talk about the question of citizenship, because that's not a requirement. It is literally a count of who is here now and where do they live. So, it's important, and Julie's so right that the stakes are high, because not only does the formulas that determine what states get different aids get driven by population, but it also determines our representation. And I chair the Legislative Redistricting Commission and Demographic Task Force that looks specifically at the legislative efforts around supporting census and then eventually redistricting, because it is directly related to how many representatives we get in Congress. So not only is it an economic question in terms of how much money we get per state based on population, but it will determine how many representatives we have representing our state in Congress. And estimates currently show that we will lose potentially one representative. Some estimates have had it being as high as 2. I think most folks have settled at 1, but in that respect, it's a zero-sum game. We're going to lose, and another state will gain. And most likely, we're talking about states that have shown dramatic population growth, like Florida or Texas, which don't necessarily share the same, philosophical and values that we share in New York City, but they will be taking our money and our political representation just based on population. So that's why it's more important than just the Trump administration now. This is about the future for the next 10 years.
And, not to be redundant and say what was already said, but plain and simple, why do we care? Why are we asking New Yorkers to participate in the census? It's because we need to get our fair share, right? New York State contributes more to the federal government than any other state in this country, and we are owed this money, right? We're talking about $675 billion for vital programs for our communities, right? We need those school seats. We complain about our children sitting in trailers in schools. If we are counted, we need to make sure that we get those federal dollars. We're talking about representation. We talked about New York State losing seats, right? New York State has lost at least one congressional seat every year, decennial census since 1940, lost 2 in 2000, 2 additional seats in 2010. We can't afford to lose congressional representation in today's time. So really, we want to make sure that each and every New Yorker participates because we are owed it and we need to get our fair share.
And we know that the local government here, that the Blas administration is budgeting $40 million for a huge initiative that you're leading. And also the state government, the Cuomo administration is putting $70 million in this effort, trying to get an accurate count. What are the organizations to where this money is going, right? What are they going to do with the money? And do those two efforts, the local and the state effort, do they overlap? Are there any synergies?
Yeah, so first of all, we talk to the state very often about the census and are working, very collaboratively with them. What I'll say, and I'll speak on the city front, and then maybe Melva or the assembly member wants to talk about the state front. So on the city side, I will say that we disseminated $19 million of the $40 million to community organizations on the ground. We had a really phenomenal process by which organizations, not-for-profits, could apply. We selected 157 of them. These are organizations that have real reach, particularly in hard-to-count communities. We have communities in New York City that in 2010, their self-response rate to the census was in the mid-30s to 40s. This is abysmal. This is shameful. The overall average rate in New York City self-response to the census in 2010 was 61.9%. That is 14 points lower than the national average. So it's like, we're New Yorkers. I mean, we're better than this. We've got to be clear. This is a national competition. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. It's a national competition. For everyone that doesn't fill the census out, that money will go to other states. And it generally, just to be clear, will go to other states that have fewer immigrant populations than we do. Why? Because, again, there is tremendous fear around the citizenship question, even though the question is off. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't make a presentation on the census where someone says to me, I'm not going to fill that form out because the citizenship question is on. And I'll say to them, actually, it's not. And so that's what we have to do, and that's where the community groups are going to be so key because they're the trusted organizations on the ground that are the trusted voice in their neighborhood.
Yeah, so to follow that up, I think when we looked at our efforts and the governor had a whole commission that produced results on how to best do this, we wanted to be complementary. So the first $20 million that we budgeted last year is designated to go to counties across the state, including the 5 counties in New York, because we know that there are other more concentrated efforts, particularly in New York, and that are being coordinated out of the mayor's office. This was to supplement the local community groups, and they would get assigned by the different borough presidents in the case of New York City, but the county executives across the state. So it's a broad swath for the distribution of the first $20 million. The second $40 million tranche is really utilizing state agencies and their capabilities to be able to really broadcast out census efforts. So this includes our Department of Labor, DMV, pretty much anybody coming in contact with a state agency between now and April will receive something from the census, either documentation, saying what it is, ability to interact, media, either physical or visual media while you're visiting an office, as well as through different websites and portals. So there's a concerted effort to integrate outreach with any agency that's touching the lives of New Yorkers, and they estimate that through those efforts, 9 million people, interact with us at some point or another in some way to be able to supplement the efforts that are going through the county process. And then thirdly is where we are to kind of finish us off. We are in the process of negotiating our budget. The governor announced an additional 10 million. Since we are in budget negotiations, we're going to try and make that number more, because we have heard from the advocates that we needed 40 million, city and state, to really, get our hard to count numbers where they should be. So we'll be making that push as legislators to make sure that there's enough money between our April and December, when there are times when our community groups are knocking on doors and really outreaching to people, and making sure that we reach those immigrant pockets that tend to be underrepresented consistently, and are able to bring them to fill out the form. I think one of the big issues that we haven't mentioned yet is this is the first year that it's going to be online, which I think is a sea change for many people. Anybody who's done a census, has always looked at and waited for the paper, the paper to come in the mail, that you filled out the form and you returned it, or you waited for an enumerator, somebody to knock on your door. This is a proactive thing, but it's not the answer. We know that there are people who don't have computers, can't fill it out on their phones, don't have the level of literacy to be able to navigate it, or are just plain afraid of doing it online. And those are things that we have to deal with as well, but it is also an opportunity to get better response rates.
So, Juan, I want to thank you for asking that question in terms of sort of the funding that's available for census outreach, right? So we are in an unprecedented time, right? An unprecedented $40 million from the city of New York between the mayor's office and the city council. We have $70 million coming from the state now for census outreach. On top of that, there's also funding through the New York State Census Equity Fund for about $3 million. We have other foundations that are also investing in census outreach, whether it's the Robin Hood Foundation or Revson. We have an enormous amount of money to spend, particularly to community-based organizations, because as Julie said, they are the trusted voices. They are the ones in the communities. They have the relationships with the individuals that we want to get counted, and we want to make sure that they are funded to do the work that we need them to do. Just in terms of comparison, in 2010, New York State, across the board, between public and private and philanthropy, we spent $5 million in outreach, right? So there's a huge difference. So coordination is imperative. It's important, right? And I know the city has been in conversations with both philanthropy as well as the state. We all work together. Abney has brought many stakeholders to the table to talk about it. But we need to talk about it, right? We need to make sure that we are not duplicating services, right? We have an application process now that's being initiated by the state, where community-based organizations can apply to their counties or their borough presidents for funding. Let's make sure that that funding is going to close gaps and not duplicating programs that's already be funded. And the only way we're going to do that is open, honest conversations with our partners around the census effort, and we just have to stay diligent. And then the other thing I just want to add is time is running out, right? Census Day is April 1st, but you can actually start filling out your census form in mid-March, March 12th. So we need to get to these communities ASAP. So we just need to make sure that we are talking to one another and that we are not wasting money. Mm-hmm.
I feel that Melva wants the assembly member to go and talk to the governor about this. And because you explain, and I'm sorry, because you're the representative of the state government or the state legislature, right? I want to, because you were explaining how like you want more money in the budget. The budget is not due till, well, the new fiscal year starts April 1st. Yep. I went to an event organized by the city, I think it was last week, 2 weeks ago? Last week, at the beginning of last week, and he felt that the city is ready to go. But you're telling me that, well, the budget, April 1st, and then I'm assuming that the process would be that these community organizations will have to apply for those funds, and then they get approval. By the time they get the money, isn't it a little too late?
So time frame on that, because it is important, and I will say that we are a little behind on this, and I think for those people who don't want to admit it, that just means they have to work harder to meet the deadline. So in conversations, Empire State Development is working on the application process. They expect to have an application ready in the next 2 weeks and to make awards before the end of February. So it is a very compact time frame. There was an attempt to do it, I think, in December, which unfortunately folks were not ready to respond in the short time frame considering the holidays to do that. So as a result, it was extended till now. But the time frame is, of course, lurking. That has been a concern for us in the legislature in terms of getting those dollars out the door, and really looking to piggyback on the efforts of the city, who got out in front, very early, immediately after their budget process, to implement that. And now, quite frankly, we know what has to be done in terms of reaching community organizations and really following the model that they put forward.
And it would be really easy, right? We have a mayor who is a Democrat, a governor who is a Democrat, and I'm assuming they're working together, right, on this? Are they?
Oh, you're asking me that question, I see.
Yes.
Look, I talk to the state all the time about the census, and the governor's point person, Rich Tobey, about the census all the time. So we are in coordinated efforts. We are on different timelines. We did at the city start early. The mayor asked me to take on this role. This is a third responsibility I've had in the administration. As was said before, I've run 2 other city agencies. Building a whole new organization from scratch is obviously a difficult endeavor, but we got it done, I think, very, very quickly, and put together a thoughtful process to get the money out the door. So our money is out the door in terms of it's gone directly to these 157 community organizations who started work in December. So, I think the Assembly member said it best in terms of the timeline, and, we look forward to working with the state on this.
And can we have an idea, because we're talking about the community organizations that are going to do the outreach, can we have an idea of what specifically these community organizations are going to be doing? Are they going to go door to door? Are they going to talk to people in forums? How is that going to work?
So I'm happy to discuss that. So one of the things, and we thought long and hard about this with the community group, so one of the things, and Melva alluded to it, there was very little money spent on outreach in 2010. Outreach has to be coordinated. We cannot have a situation where groups are going out there and we're not tracking the data. So we wanted to really focus on data metrics. So for every phone call that a community group is making, that information flows back to us and we track it. We're using technology that is being utilized on presidential campaigns. So specifically, we're using Hustle, we're using Mobilize, we're using NGP Van. So we're using these 3 different technologies to track every single phone call that's been made, every single text message that's sent out. Door knocking is a complicated issue. Door knocking, in our opinion, and really in talking to the local federal census bureau, we didn't want to confuse people. So to have people out there knocking on doors now before the census even starts can be very confusing messaging for people. Then some people think they've filled out the census, so it's not sure. So we did not want that to happen. So our efforts are largely focused right now on more phone banking, text messaging, events, and things of that nature.
So, we are very close to Census Day, and I think, there's been a lot of groups that have been out there doing outreach, doing events, giving sort of public awareness. Like I see Carrie here from Uptown Grand Central. They've been doing a lot of events here, but we really need to get people to fill out their census form. We're at that place where we need to do get out the count efforts where people are actually filling out their census form. And I think as community-based organizations and community groups are sort of going through their activities, it's ranging everywhere from outreach and education to actually creating sites like Julie was talking about, how here in the museum, they're gonna go through an interactive exhibit. I don't wanna talk about it, I'll let you talk about it. But the important part about that is you need to get people to the point where they're actually filling it out. And for us, that's the important part now. Last year in the fall, it was great to do sort of the community events and doing the pre-education about why it's important, what's at stake. Now the time is getting people actually either on their phones or to computers and filling them out. So we've been in conversations with groups that that are creating these census resource centers where they are opening up their doors and having computers where people can come in and fill out their census form. The libraries are ramping up, and they're actually being places. And I think community-based organizations are really working very closely with those partners who are allowing people to actually fill out their census form.
Yeah, no, can I just add on one point on that? So the libraries, we gave $1.4 million to the public library systems, the 3 public library systems. So all 219 branches are going to have staff trained in Census. Computer terminals will serve as pop-up centers. We also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, we put pledge cards on everyone's seat. So one big part of our operation, I spent a lot of time talking about community groups, but the other big part, for those of you that have ever volunteered on any kind of political campaign, is the field campaign. So we are running a field campaign. We basically have volunteers. We've divided the city into 245 neighborhoods. We've established in each neighborhood a neighborhood organizing census committee, NOCCS, or NOCS for short. So you can fill out one of these pledge cards to volunteer, or you can go on our website if that's easier. We have thousands and thousands of volunteers all around the city that are helping us in our efforts.
And I think just a couple with the efforts that are being done, it's really about mobilizing and activating those organizations that have really deep roots in immigrant communities. Like when you're talking about in East Harlem, it's somebody like Union Settlement that provides vital services, daycare, after-school meals to to folks all across the district, but including those with strong immigrant populations that would be undercounted. Organizations like Little Sisters, LSA. So it's strategic partners that we know have deep roots that, when mobilized, are not necessarily door knocking, but can unlock, and demystify a lot of the noise that continues to exist around the census conversation. And Julie, in her process, did a great job of, selecting organizations across the city that really embody this connection to normally either underrepresented or disconnected communities.
Sorry, I just want to add. So in talking about sort of the community-based organization and partners, one thing that ABNY is also working with is sort of what we call non-traditional partners, so actors around the city who you might not think would be activated for census outreach. And we are working with, for instance, major employers to make sure that their employees get counted, because when you talk about hard-to-count communities and you talk about the communities and individuals that are less likely to fill out the census form, there are, in addition to immigrant populations, there are historically hard-to-count communities. Communities in this country that have had a complicated relationship with government, and they just don't trust it. So how do we also get to those? And when you look at industries like the retail industries, there's a large majority of their employees who come from these hard-to-count communities. So how do we partner with those industries to make sure that, number one, they're just getting their employees counted? Right? So we are working with the hospital centers, we're working with retailers, we're working with technology, we're working with a number of different non-traditional partners to make sure that we are getting all corners of New York City. This is an all hands on deck effort. At the beginning, we talked about why do we want New Yorkers to get counted? We need each and every New Yorker to complete the census form so that, again, we could get our fair share.
And during the rally that I went to, well, it was like a rally, basically, rally for the census last week, I heard Mayor de Blasio saying, the President Trump doesn't want this census to be successful. They don't want a real, accurate count. Is that so? And why?
Well, the comments that the mayor made are clearly about a number of different things. One is the citizenship question. We, as I mentioned earlier, were a plaintiff on the lawsuit. There is no other way to look at the Trump administration's attempt to add the citizenship question other than an effort to hurt immigrant communities. That is what this was about. There was clear evidence in the case that the administration wanted to add the question to specifically cause an undercount in immigrant communities, not only in New York City, but all across the country. That's why we sued. So the mayor is 100% correct that effort to add the citizenship question, that's what that was about. But it's really even more insidious than only the citizenship question, because when you think about it, there's also been an effort to defund the census in general. So specifically, the administration cut the number of area census office or ACOs that are in New York City, so our population grew, yet we have far fewer area census offices. Well, that's point one. Point two is they also made the decision not to have walk-in centers. Now, in a city like New York, where there are over 200 languages spoken, we need walk-in centers. The rationale that was given is, well, the census is online, so there won't need to be walk-in centers. We think just the opposite. Because the census is online, you can also, by the way, fill it out by phone in the traditional mail form, to be clear. Because of that, there are going to be so many questions that might arise. Of course you need walk-in centers, so not having them, we feel, is particularly harmful to an area like New York. And then third, they made the decision to cut the door knocker staff really nationwide almost in half. So these are three ways, and there are others, that the census has largely been defunded. That is a clear attempt to hurt really progressive cities that have large immigrant communities.
And just to dovetail on that a little bit, if we are concerned about timeframes, which we all are, the city was certainly first out of the gate, but the state is now picking it up. But we are united in our concern that the federal government's efforts around outreach marketing, are pretty silent thus far. And in particular, when we've had conversations about when is the paid media campaign going to begin, how many folks have seen an advertisement about Census either online or on television thus far? Not counting NYC, media. Little to zero. I see nothing in terms of feedback. Well, maybe one. Right. Yeah, for jobs. Yeah. So there's a concern, that there's not a concerted awareness campaign that has come from the federal government about what is happening. And when we've talked about their time frame, they're rolling out in March. They plan to begin that campaign in March of 2020, which is why we have worked together and so aggressively in terms of the amount of resources that we're going to put out there to try and address what we think is this tremendous shortcoming in terms of federal efforts, but then what we also look at as more insidiously as an effort to suppress participation in places like this by either fear or just keeping people ignorant as to what the process is and why it's important.
I guess I have to, since everyone's, but okay. So listen, this is the fact, right? Wanting to add a question on the decennial census about the citizenship question the motives were very clear. Like, we know that a citizenship question is asked on the American Community Survey, the survey that goes out every year, about 2.7% of the population, and we know from that data that there are certain communities that are reluctant to respond not only to that question, to the form, because of those questions. Now, the lawsuit was based on how the Census Bureau added the question on the form, right? There is a long process when you change anything on the census form so that it can be vetted. We know that the federal government didn't follow that process, right? We know that they just randomly wanted to add a question about citizenship. So I think the motives are very clear why the federal government wanted to do that. And as Julie said earlier, because it's not on there, we have that much more work to do because the conversation and the discourse in American politics around it has already happened. The damage is already done, and we have to spend a lot of time convincing individuals, one, it's not on there, but two, even if you fill it out, your information is protected, and it's worth filling it out. Like, the pros outweigh the cons.
Immigrant communities, everybody's talking about immigrant communities. We need to reach out to them, and the two arguments that I hear the most are we can't lose the funding, the federal funding, right? We need the federal funding, and that's why we need an accurate count. And also, we are at risk of losing political representation. But I'm wondering, a lot of immigrants in New York City, they might be saying, I don't care about political representation. I can't vote. So this politician is coming to me telling me to fill out the census form because he doesn't want to lose his job after the new maps are redrawn. So what's a counter argument to that?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and I'm so happy you're asking it. So one of the things that I was most struck with when I first took on this job is the fact that the low response rates to the census in 2010, and I thought back to it, and I chaired a community board. I chaired Community Board 1 in Lower Manhattan in 2010, and I remember a person from the Federal Census Bureau coming by and talking about the census. And they droned on in a very, banal way about how fill the census out, it's in the Constitution, it's your civic duty, it's the law. No one paid any attention. Now, if that person had stood up there and said, did you know if you don't take the 2 minutes to fill this out, you will lose funding at your local public schools? We would have had a 90% plus response rate in Lower Manhattan. So what we need to do, I agree with what you're saying to the extent that if you look at our messaging from the city, our messaging always starts with the programs, not the political representation. Because when you have a situation when someone cannot put food on the table for their child at night, do they care about losing a congressional seat, or do they care that their child might lose Head Start funding or free lunch? They care about, obviously, the program. So our messaging is always very focused on the programs. There are 300 programs that depend on the census. So obviously the big ones are public education. But it's also, as I mentioned, free lunch. I mentioned SNAP, Medicaid, senior centers, for those that are focused on transportation issues, roads, tunnels, bridges. It's almost as if no matter what the issue is that most affects their daily life, I can guarantee you it's linked to the census. So that is what we're trying to convey. We're trying to micro-target our messaging. So the community that I chaired, the community board, Lower Manhattan, where we were dealing obviously with 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy, or when I'm out in the Rockaways and they're, again, still recovering from Sandy, I focus on emergency preparedness. That funding is linked to the census. So the census is about issues that affect every single New Yorker, no matter what your circumstances are.
And as elected officials, it's our responsibility to personalize it in terms of what it means in everybody's district. So for East Harlem, it means we don't get enough money for the public schools that we know are traditionally underfunded. When we talk about things like the 2nd Avenue subway, which most people like, but recognize it doesn't get to 125th Street yet. And it won't unless we can get the federal dollars, both representation and support, to be able to do that. Our Health and Hospitals Corporation, our public health institutions that rely on Medicaid dollars that are immediately driven by population. And when we talk about issues around sustainability, infrastructure, all of those things that are important to our daily lives to either get to where we're going, receive a basic service, or keep everybody well. It's trying to make that connection, because this abstract thing called the census and getting counted doesn't necessarily translate to my daily life and how that equates, and we have to remind people how it does.
So you started out talking about, we are concerned about our immigrant populations not responding. And as I stated before, there are historically hard to count populations here in New York City that may be immigrants or may not, right? Early on, we did focus groups in a lot of the hard to count communities. And if you look at sort of the numbers of the communities that were reluctant to respond, a lot of them were African American of African descent, right? Including Afro-Caribbean, as well as the Hasidic Jewish community in Brooklyn, right? So it's just not about sort of the citizenship question. There are other barriers to why people are hesitant, right? Maybe they don't want to divulge information in the household, whether it's how many children they have, whether it is sort of who's living in the household because it will affect their housing. But what both my fellow panelists were alluding to is that micro-targeted messaging, right? So our research showed that it takes millions of tiny micro touches in order for individuals to sort of receive information. And I think that's what we have to do, right? We have to talk about how census funding supports our way of life, right? our quality of life. How do we communicate to individual communities on an individual level about the benefits of census dollars to their everyday life? And it's about those micro touches, it's about those micro targeted messages, and it's about letting them know that you need to participate in the census because it will create those school seats, right? We talk about communities that have an 85% or 65% response rate. That means you have 65% of resources in that school for the next 10 years. So you worried about your children in trailers on outside, it's because the school doesn't have the funding to support it. So how do we micro-target the information to these individual communities so that it resonates? The story is real to them. And that's how we message to all New Yorkers who are hard to count, whether they're immigrant communities, whether Afro-Caribbean, whatever it is. This is why it's important to fill out the census form.
Before we open the floor to questions, can you tell me about the Electoral College and its connection to the census? Because I didn't know about that till last week.
You want me to talk about it? Sure. Okay, so one of the, you said before, well, perhaps it's more important to focus on the funding in terms of the messaging than political representation, and so we have done that. However, the Electoral College, it's really important that people understand that we will, in an undercount, lose congressional seats, and that is directly linked to the Electoral College. So for those who are really focused on politics and on the presidential election, it is all about the Electoral College. If we lose 1 to 2 seats, which is what is expected in a real undercount, those seats will largely go to states that have much smaller immigrant populations where there are not as many issues around fear and intimidation around filling out the census. So it basically changes the balance of the Electoral College for years, if not decades, to come. So this is really our democracy at stake with the census. It's not an overstatement to say that one of the most important issues that affects not only the city's future, but what happens in the presidential election down the line will be this census.
Anything else that you want to add? No? Okay, so we're going to open the floor to questions.
On that note.
I'm sure you have questions, yes?
I just wanted to ask when the form will be online, when it'll start.
So March 12th. So it starts March 12th. You'll be able to go online and fill it out. But if I could just mention, also on March 12th, that is when the Federal Census Bureau will be sending the first mailing, so people will start to receive it on March 12th. In New York City, approximately 75% of New Yorkers in that first mailing from the Federal Census Bureau, it will say you can fill the form out online, and it'll give you a code, a little computer code. You can go to your phone, you can go to any computer anywhere and fill it out. If you lose that code, it is not a problem. Not a problem at all. You can go again to your phone or to any computer and put in your name and address and have an automatic match. The other 25% of New Yorkers are going to get the paper form from the outset. And so they will have the paper form. If you do not fill the census out on that first mailing, you will have approximately four additional mailings that the Federal Census Bureau will send to you. If you don't fill it out on that last mailing, they will send someone to knock on your door. And this is just my humble opinion, I view that as a failure. And I view that as a failure because that meant that person didn't self-respond. And when that person doesn't self-respond, the data to New York City is not as good. We have to remember that when door knockers come, they are talking not only to the person who may not answer the door, but they might talk to someone they meet in the hallway and say, oh, if they can't get into the building, how many people live in that apartment? And that is how incorrect data is conveyed. That is, by the way, how over 1 million children nationwide under the age of 5 were left out of the census in 2010. They were invisible. They were never counted. So for those of us, that are parents, and I'm a parent, that child who then goes to kindergarten, it is not till they're a sophomore in high school when then they could be counted again. It's basically 10 years before they're counted again. So that's a little bit about the process.
And it's per household?
It's per household. One household fills it out.
So one form for one apartment.
Correct. And you need to list everyone. So I get this question all the time. Like people say, well, I have a relative sleeping on my couch when I fill the census out. Should I include them? Yes. The census is a snapshot in time. It's the best way to look at it is it's like a photograph of your household, that moment that you're filling the census out. Who is living in that home at that time?
The form is in how many of the 800 languages spoken in New York?
So it's in 13.
Right, there are 12 non-English languages the forms offered, but the Census Bureau does offer assistance in 59 languages on how to fill it out. But the form itself, there are 12 non-English languages.
I want to talk about data security because now this is the first time that the census is online. I think it also lends itself to a lot of problems because nothing is secure in today's world. So I was wondering what kind of measures you guys are taking or the Census Bureau is taking to ensure that an accurate count and that it's not tampered with.
Sure. So I'll talk on the city side, and I don't know if you want to open it up to the federal
They can
census.
speak best.
Yeah, because they can speak best about it. So I'll tell you from the city side, all of our city agencies that work in data security have been working on this. So, for example, all of our pop-up centers with the public library system, we are really focused on data security because we do not want anyone to certainly have an issue. What I will say before asking maybe Jolie from the Federal Census Bureau to talk a little bit about data security is it's also important to remember what's on the census. It is 10 questions. A lot of times people say, I'm not going to fill it out because it's asking my social security number. It's not asking that. People say to me, I'm not going to fill it out because it's asking my income. It's not asking that either. The census is 10 questions. It's your name, your address, your age, your gender. Do you own or rent your home? Who is living in the home? And their respective ages. That's what the census is. So I think it's super important to understand. It's not asking banking information or social security number, anything like that. But again, the Federal Census Bureau is in the best position to talk about their security measures.
Hi, so I can tell you that we have spent billions of dollars making sure that this data is secure as possible. It will be encrypted, it will be triple encrypted behind firewalls, etc. The most private way to fill out the census will be to do it online. That online questionnaire, the responses will shoot directly into our database where it will be protected. I can't speak much more beyond that. I can just say that we've had industry experts working on this for years, and our goal is not only as complete and accurate a count as possible, but to keep the information safe.
And I would just add, sorry, so there are a couple of concerns, right? So it's the devices that you're actually completing the census form on. There's then the transmission of the data, right, to the Census Bureau, and then it's where the information is being stored. All of those things have been sort of talked through and discussed. You're absolutely right. In today's age, right, anything can happen, but I can tell you there have been a team of experts working on this, and there are recommendations, right? If you look at Data and Society, who's working with the Leadership Conference on a national level, who have actually worked with the Census Bureau and is working on this locally, there are recommendation toolkits to say if you have concerns about how your data is either being stored or transmitted, these are things you can do, right? So make sure that if you're going to a public place like a library, make sure that the data, and is not stored on the computers that you're filling out, right? If you're using your phone, most new phones update regularly. So there is actually encrypted software that you don't have to worry about. But there are materials to educate you on the ways your data is secure because it's on everyone's mind.
Yes, what about shelter residents and homeless? How are they getting counted?
Sure. So there are two different
Always,
ways
every
that the
time.
shelter population is counted. One is something called group quarters, which is the way that the Federal Census Bureau counts individuals in a facility where there's an administrator. So the administrator of the shelter is going to be working directly with the Federal Census Bureau. And those conversations, which the City of New York has been involved in, have already started to make sure that they're talking to the proper administrator of each shelter facility. In terms of those that are homeless on the streets, there will be 3 days in the spring where the Federal Census Bureau will do a count around New York City. We, at the city side, will obviously work very closely with the Federal Census Bureau on that to make sure everyone is counted.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what you're doing in real time to assess the effectiveness of the outreach efforts that are being made by these organizations that are getting funded to do it.
Great question. So a couple different things. So we have set up our contract with each community group in installments. So the funding that they received is dependent on them meeting our data metrics. And that data metrics, it depends on each single group. So it's the number of events that they've had, the number of phone banks that they've done, the number of text messages, the number of census ambassadors they've appointed. Like, so we have a whole series of data that they must hit to get the next installment payment in terms of the grant. That is one way. The second way, and we haven't talked about this yet, so I'm so happy you asked this, is that the Federal Census Bureau, starting on March 20th, is going to be giving us real-time data by census tract, which we will have on our website. So we will have, for every census tract in New York City, and the census tract is give or take 3,000 people, the data on how each community is doing. So East Harlem. So the assembly member will be able to see on our website and on the Federal Census Bureau website how his district is doing. And that allows us as a city census office to very quickly deploy not only resources, but our volunteers that are working in that neighborhood, the community groups. So we have a really targeted system every single day to monitor what's working and not. We have not discussed our advertising. We are launching an $8 million advertising campaign. You will start to see our ads in mid-February. We are using data analytics to monitor our ads so that we will know what ads are really resonating and which ones are not.
So you've convinced me that this is really important, so I signed up on the website to be a volunteer.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but what exactly will that entail?
Sure. So that's a great question. Thank you. And if you don't want to sign up online, again, we have our pledge cards here, and this is Arthi from my office who can raise her hand here. You can give her the pledge card. So what does it mean to be a volunteer for our office? So basically what it means is you have a couple different choices. One is you can work directly in your neighborhood. We are going to be phone banking, so we would ask you and we would give you information on people living in your neighborhood. We give you a script that you could call to urge them to fill the census out. That is the easiest way to volunteer. So you can volunteer from your home, then they're flexible hours and all of that. We also are doing teach-ins. We have done dozens and dozens of teach-ins where we teach people in how to talk about the census and how to conduct events around the census. So that's another way. So you will, now that you've signed up, receive a call from our office in the next couple of days asking which way that you might want to volunteer. A third way that you can volunteer is many people have said to us, well, I'd like to volunteer in a hard-to-count neighborhood. That's great because we need help. So many people we're going to ask to phone bank in other neighborhoods where we need more volunteers and more people power.
Hi, I was wondering, what do you recommend? I work for a nonprofit, and I just wanted to know, what do you recommend for a small organization that has a one-person team that is sort of tasked with making sure that we get people counted sort of throughout Queens? So.
First, you're not a grant recipient from our office, just to clarify.
Yes.
You are or you're not?
We are not.
You're not. Okay. So I would recommend coming to one of our teach-ins. That is the best way because we go through everything you need to know about how to make sure that we're spreading the word on the census. So the teach-in would be the best way. We're holding them in every single borough, so there are many ways to participate in that.
So, there's ways you can incorporate census outreach and census messaging in your everyday activities, and that's probably the most feasible way for a community-based organization of one. And I think that there are several ways, and I know we can talk about how you can do that, but without funding, and without sort of a massive staff, speaking to one person, right? We ask everyone in this room to be an ambassador, speak to 1, 2, 3 people, but there's ways that you can absolutely incorporate it in your everyday activities, in your touch points with the communities that you work with.
And I think along those lines is also, this is an army of people on the internet, right? Social media, you all have tremendous followings, and people who maybe access you that don't access other places in other ways. That's a very easy way to integrate it into your email blast if you're an organization, your newsletters, your website, your social media activities. Every once in a while, putting out there that you did something for census and that it's coming. So just other ways, to extend the ambassadorship to your online presences, that's other ways to infiltrate your communities and networks.
And that's exactly right. And the only other thing I would say about that, for those of you that are members of a community board, a civic organization, a house of worship, any organization, the single best way to get the word out is starting March 12th to, at every announcement, at every single event, take 2 minutes to announce, have you filled the census out? Here's the website. It takes 2 minutes to fill out. Let's all take our phones and do it right now. Doing that, if we can have every group doing that every single day, starting March 12th through the July when the census ends, we would really have a phenomenal response rate in New York.
Do you all have a sense of, is there a figure that you all estimate the population to be in New York State, and say come end of May, mid-June, will you be tracking sort of how many people have been reported and have a sense of whether or not there is a severe undercount?
Okay, so I'll talk on the city side. On the city side, as I mentioned, we're going to release these numbers every single day starting March 20th. So everyone will be able to, it's going to be totally transparent how every single neighborhood is doing, who's, and to be clear, it's not by name, it's not by block, it's not by building, it's by census tract. So it will tell a neighborhood how they are doing in terms of the response rate. And that is how we'll know, and hopefully how we'll be able to boost the numbers. The census doesn't end until the end of July. So that is when the final numbers will be reported, and that's when we'll really know where we are. But the greatest thing about the online, other than the ease of response, is this data now that we're going to have that never existed in 2010 in real time.
And then, we have estimates of what we think it is through the Americas surveys, giving us estimates. So we think 20 million for the state, 8.6 million for the city. But this is why we do the count, because this is the only way to be accurate and precise on it. And I'm sure our fellow panelists from CUNY, who's not here, who spends a lot of time tracking data and demographics and actually mapping out the hard to count areas, would have a lot to say on that subject. But the resources are there at the CUNY Center as well to track along progress, in addition to what Julie mentioned with the census.
Correct. So there are other data sets that we can use to make estimates of how many people actually are here. That's how we get the self-response rate. Like, that's how we compare, right? There are other ways that we calculate or tabulate how many people are here. But the census, the decennial census purpose, is so that we can do that enumeration for an accurate. And then, as Julie said, with that real-time data, we can see how communities are doing, and then we can respond rapidly so that we can deploy additional resources in those to get to those estimated numbers.
And so along the same vein then, if you say you're projecting a loss of 1 to 2 electoral votes, so is that if 100% of the people respond?
No, the losing the 1 to 2 seats is in the event of an undercount. It is expected that and I'm just again going to keep my focus on the city of New York where we're operating, that the city of New York, there's supposed to be an undercount. That's why the mayor and the city council, created and why we have this effort that we're doing on behalf of the city to try to counteract that. The Federal Census Bureau has estimated that New York City's self-response rate in 2020 will be dropped to 58%. From the 61.9% we were at. So this is frightening at best, terrifying, alarming. So we need all of your help. Like, I can't overstate this enough. Like, everything is at stake that we care about and that fund these 300 programs that New Yorkers vitally depend on. And so we need everyone's help to tell every one of their friends, neighbors, members of whether church, synagogue, mosque, civic group, any organization that you may be affiliated with. We need your help. This is an all hands on deck approach. We need to count everyone. We are counting Democrats, we're counting Republicans, we're counting independents, we're counting those that are not politically affiliated. Every single New Yorker must be counted. We're all in this together.
And with that, I want to thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Our hosts, and all of you for being here tonight. Thank you so much.